Welcome to the Blueprint Roundtable. I've got my business partners, Krissy Manzano and Chuck Brotman today. And today's question, should board members and or investors be a part of the hiring process when hiring for individual contributors? Krissy, I'm going to kick it to you first.
So if I'm just to give a yes, no response right off the bat, it's no. And I'll explain why. Although nothing is black and white. So it's not 100% no or no 100% of the time, but the majority of the time. Just having experience with this and seeing it. So I think, look, I understand when companies are small. I'll go back to like why, this happens. When companies are smaller and they have less resources, you see this happen. Because they don't have a team to interview, right? And so you're wanting to get other people's perspective, which is totally understandable and fair. And you have board members and investors who will often say, like, when they obviously know your company, they invested in it, they're invested in its growth and it being successful. And many of them can often, have background of managing teams or I hired all these people and blah, 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 right? But having been through this multiple times, it almost never works. And the reason why is for a couple of reasons. One, board members and investors are not involved in the day-to-day, no matter how much they want the company to succeed and no matter how much they have personally invested. There's an emotional tie to it for them at another level that is very different than I'm managing a team. When I'm a board member or I'm an investor, it's a very different position in how you interview and assess than as a hiring manager. And that's one. Number two, what I find hiring managers, including CEOs that will even do this, is the board member and the investor are often, they're not a part, because they're not a part of the day-to-day, they're not a part of the hiring process when it comes to like, okay, this is what you're assessing for and you're assessing for. So they just got to kind of go with whatever questions they want to ask. It's around their schedule, which is very busy because it's probably not the only company that they're investing in, right? And so everyone else that's a part of the hiring process ends up not really assessing. They're assessing for what they think the board member will like or what the investor will like. And what I've told executives and what I told people going through that is listen, because they're often not aligned in what they want. And it becomes like an ego power thing that's happening. And what I've told them is like, listen, if you hire the wrong person that doesn't work out, they're not going to care, the investor and board member, that they're the ones that said yes to them. The responsibility and accountability still goes on you. And so it just becomes this dynamic where like the people that have the power and the final yes are the ones that are not going to be onboarding them. They're not going to be overly investing in them. And so it just doesn't, I get the reality of what it looks like on paper, but that's not actually how it plays out. And so that's why I don't think they should be involved in the interview process for ICs. For executives, sure. Or for senior leaders, sure, because they can be a selling point. But when it comes to ICs, I think it is incredibly time consuming. There's often a ton of misalignment, and it's not effective.
Chuck, I think you make some good points. Although I also wonder if you're sort of mixing, bad practice with the practice altogether. I certainly think it can be. So my answer is it depends. But in many cases, I think it's a great idea to invite, one of your investors to participate in the hiring process for even an individual contributor, particularly if you're an early stage company and this is a kind of a founding IC role, whether for sales or customer success. And these are really important hires. But I think to all of your good points, when you do this, it's imperative that you treat them as an extension of your org in the process and not simply as a heavyweight that you assume. Right? Assumptions are bad in recruiting and hiring and in sales and everything else. So you can't operate on assumptions. And if you're bringing them in as an extension of your team to help assess and close candidates, you need to be clear and specific on what you expect from them, why, where you want their feedback before you go live with the search and bringing them in. And then you bring them in accordingly and as best as you can, hold them to the standards that you've set for that role in the process. And in some cases, maybe you're inviting them to simply help, sell a candidate because of their ability to talk about why they made an investment in your organization, where they see opportunity in the market. I mean, a lot of that can be also super valuable for candidates as well, who often don't get those opportunities, right? So we're talking about this as if it's only about, you being rigorous and, and avoiding mistakes, but it can also be a great way to give candidates access to, senior influences on your business, starting with your board members and your investors. So like with everything, it has to be done the right way. And we've talked about this in prior episodes and some of our content, similar to when you bring in an executive on to assess candidates, like don't assume that they're just going to competently come up with their own assessment standards. You need to understand what they're looking for and why. And if you've got concerns that it's misaligned with, what you're assessing for, you have that conversation early versus later. So I think the same concept applies here.
Maybe.
But, I mean, you're right, Chris. We've seen it. The limited times we've seen it, it tends to be some of the very early stage companies that we've recruited for. And it has more often than not gone a little sideways, but I think that's more a reflection of some kind of maturity considerations. I think the practice itself can be great. Just needs to be done the right way.
Well, I even remember sending a candidate to a CEO. When I was a hiring manager and they didn't like them. And even though I'd sent other great candidates and we got a ton of people hired, I remember feeling like so nervous to send the next, there is this kind of like power imbalance but what I would say is if you feel like you have to bring in a board member or you have to bring in an investor, you need to make sure that you can own that process. If you cannot, if you feel like their feedback is going to change what you look for in a negative way, or that it's going to be hard to keep them aligned, or they're not really sorry, Mr. CEO, but I'm not going to sit here and go over these 4 questions. I've been interviewing forever and you can't you don't think you're going to be able to rein them in. Then I would say it is so much better to work with a consultant that can come in and interview or recruit whomever than to use them, because they will delay your process and they will absolutely not strengthen your candidate pool of finding the right people. But
you have to have upfront alignment on what are the competencies and behaviors that are being assessed and how they're going to go about that and what they're going to look for. And then from there, right, you also have to be open to the fact that they may come back and call out some things that you hadn't seen, right? It's not always going to be simply blessing your candidates. I do think at a certain level, it's worth noting that sometimes you will get feedback that will call into question your assessment to date, right? And may lead you to go in a different direction. That's okay, but you need to know what they're going in to assess and why. And there should be some alignment. If there's not, that's a conversation that you want to have, whether it's using executives as an intermediary or your direct manager, right? I mean, obviously you need to be respectful of senior investors and the like, but you have to be aligned, right?
Yep, totally.
There you have
Perfect. Well, thank you both for your time and your inputs. We'll chat again next week.